panel is about leadership and innovation, and how do leaders at public radio stations absorb new ideas and integrate them into the operations. So taking it from the lab, out of the lab, and become new products. So who we have on stage with me is Ellen Oost, who's the Director of Development from Louisville Public Media. So Ellen was the recipient of the red thread message from Tracy Karam, who you heard from earlier today. And next on stage we have Andi McDaniel, who's the Senior Director of Content and News at WAMU. And so she got her persuasive messaging from Maddie and Rachel about how to do the membership program at DCist. And then we have Paul Adams, who's the Director of Corporate Underwriting at Capitol Public Radio. And your team is still experimenting, so you haven't yet gotten your persuasive conversation. But, so welcome, everybody. Help me, join me in welcoming them to the stage. So I wanted to start out by directly asking Ellen and Andi like their perception of the project and what they heard at the end of the project, and like what was the case that you got, and how did you respond?
Sure. Well, this was really fascinating to watch Tamsin, because now I know exactly what was happening behind the scenes before the presentation. It makes even more sense now. But I think the team did a really good job of tapping into some of our recent goals that we set in the strategic plan. So they knew that we had this new thing showing up in our revenue budget that just said new revenue. And we were trying to find ways to develop that revenue not on the radio. So in a way, they kind of had it set up for them. They just needed to be able to show that the work that they were doing provided an outlet for that. So they were able to show through the event stream that they developed that people would actually show up time and time again, which made it easier to sell sponsorships for those events. And also, just that this big group of like nebulous people that we didn't know much about who came over from Do 502, it's about 50,000 people at this point. They took the time to go through the persona piece of it, which I think was important because we hadn't really figured that out yet. So it helped us to figure out those people need things that are slightly different from our public radio audience, and but they still cared enough from a membership perspective that when we asked them for money, that they would respond. So
that's awesome. And Andi, what was your story of receiving there?
So I always feel like a little bit of an outlier in this category, because I have to confess that most things that, for instance, Maddie and Rachel might bring to me as an idea around which they have a lot of enthusiasm, they're like through the fourth or fifth word in the sentence, and I'm like, I love it. That sounds like a brilliant idea. How can I help make that happen? And I think just as, you know, I'm maybe the sort of unusual executive in that if I'd heard, for instance, Rebecca's pitch about Market Basket, again, I would have been sold by, you know, word 5. And so I would actually say that what I valued about the persuasion, and it's wonderful to see the architecture behind it, is that it helps me to have advocates alongside me, because it isn't, even though I can make decisions over content, I still have to achieve buy-in from marketing and technology and our general manager. And the more that the folks on my content team can make a credible case that shows that they respect and have thought about the marketing and revenue and other aspects of it, the better it makes me look, and the more effective it makes all of us.
That's a really great point. Yeah, because I think it's not just one single person getting to decide and believing it, but it's the whole ecosystem, right?
Well, and I could say yes, and then I could send them on their way, and they could run into a bunch of obstacles because there isn't buy-in, which has never happened.
Right. As leaders, and both the three of you are involved in the proposals to work on these projects, what, in your words, like what do you see as the ROI on an innovation project? Because and I'm going to I want to talk about failure in a couple minutes, but there is some inherent risk to testing something that could be a terrible idea. And so as a leader that's responsible for the success of either the whole organization or a portion of it, how do you make the choice to go into that?
Well, I think what we really liked about this process was thinking about it in a different way, and that it doesn't have to be this big, risky project. You can do something quickly with resources, but not a ton of them. And you know, it can be in a space where if you screw up a little bit the first time, you can iterate and fix it and try something else, which is something we're always doing as an organization. But this kind of, again, put a structure to it, gave us the tools so that we could actually recognize whether something was a failure or a success.
And Andi, do you see, what were some of the tangible, like when you talk with your peers, what do you see as like, what's the return on the time that they spent on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's different to think about the ROI of BizLab's participation versus the ROI of our DCist experiment, which we were already very much committed to. I think this experience, it feels like, gave us some structure and discipline to a path of experimentation that otherwise would have been more unwieldy and freeform, and that forced us to look at results at particular intervals and sort of reflect on what they meant and how we might change course. I mean, for me in general, I think we have to think, especially in public media, about innovation not as, we don't sort of create a cute incubator to test things out because we should all just have some fun every once in a while. It's actually a necessary hedge against changes in audience behavior. So it's an investment in what we're going to require 10 years from now. And I think that's an important context.
I think that's a fantastic point. Paul, you and I have talked about how do you, I would love for you to say what you've shared with me about letting your team stop their day job or a portion of their day job and go off and do this. Because if innovation is critical for moving an organization forward, how do you justify that and let it go? And you're in a unique position in a commission-driven organization.
Right. And Lisa Kelly might answer this differently than I will, but originally, when the idea came to us, I was looking at other departments, and nobody really wanted to weigh in on this thing. And so it fell back on okay, Paul, if you're going to do it, go ahead. And so trying to find the right people, and the fact that this was a revenue generator that was no longer generating that revenue. Kelly's relatively new to public radio and new to cap radio, and Lisa's a real veteran. So I think putting them together, giving them the freedom to build this into their daily business, because they are straight commission salespeople, and actually they were both able to actually raise money that they wouldn't have had the opportunity to raise before. So, but I know it's taken a toll on them too.
Did they take a financial hit because of working on an innovation project?
I think so.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
We should ask them up to discuss that.
I'll let you know afterwards.
Yeah. I'm already seeing some Slido questions. So if people want to, I'll switch to Slido in a couple minutes if people want to chime in and ask some more questions. Andi, one of the things that you and I talked about was the editorial. So our panel earlier on the editorial versus business silos or in the firewall, and your team of of Rachel and Maddie working together on this, and it wasn't really a side gig for them. It wasn't like they had to stop their main job because the DCist and membership around that is what their main focus was. Can you share some comments about like how do you think of specifically Rachel as the editor-in-chief of the DCist and her role in terms of a revenue project?
Yeah, it's a little hard to contain all of my thoughts on this particular topic. First of all, we're incredibly lucky. Actually, I'll say it this way. I think WAMU is incredibly lucky to have in me and in Rachel two editorial leaders who not only aren't allergic to the revenue side of the equation, but actually embrace it as part of the entrepreneurial underpinning of what content is and what makes content work. There's no question that DCist couldn't function, that we couldn't have had the success that we've had already with the membership program, with a number of grants that we've procured, if we didn't have someone leading it who was operating, looking at the whole pie. And my hope, I think in my most optimistic moments, I think public media is going to continue to cultivate more and more leaders in content who are CEOs of a mini business. I think you have to think of it that way. I don't think we get to be exempt from the business side of the equation, but it is really hard to find people working in content who embrace that. I can't tell you how many positions I've hired for where I found somebody who's a really great writer, editor, producer, on-air person, but who doesn't want to mess with the other side of things. And when you find somebody who gets that, it's such a powerful thing, and that's part of the reason that my orientation is generally how do I get things out of the way of this team, because they so have the right formula.
That's fascinating, particularly in light of the panel we had earlier today. Yeah, so if people have more questions on that, please chime in. Okay, I want to talk about failure. So one of the mantras of design thinking is fail fast. And the reason why we push the teams to move quickly is because you don't want to spend 4 months on something and then fail. You want to spend 2 weeks on that thing and then fail. How do you guys feel about failure? Andi, when we chatted about this, you're like, not so sure.
Well, my first reaction was, crap, I don't know if we took enough risks, because I can't recall enough. Like, I don't have a perfect gem of a failure that I feel like we learned from. I mean, there are two that stand out. One, actually, and I suspect that Maddie and Rachel will be nodding their heads at this one, we spent a ton of time trying to find the perfect tool by which to launch our membership program. And ultimately, for a lot of reasons, we couldn't make that work. And then it was very discouraging. It felt like, I think we maybe failed too slowly on that one. But it took a long time to figure out what the institutional rhythms were telling us, which was that it just wasn't going to fly. Mm-hmm. And then the other failure, I think, is that we, and this refers to the thing that earlier I said has never happened ever, I think we have really struggled to get buy-in from across the whole organization. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I find that innovation tends to happen led by like the doers and the jumper inners and kind of the scrappy ones, which is great, and you want to give those folks more and more attention and resources. But sometimes their willingness can fill a vacuum that should be filled by 20% of your marketing team and 20% of the technology team. And maybe those teams don't totally get what you're trying to do, but we definitely, we did more than this one team should have had to carry. Mm-hmm. And I don't really know what the lesson is from that, except that I think we need to probably do a stronger job of making our case. To those teams from the get-go. And a lot of that's on me in terms of getting their buy-in.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Ellen, did you observe failure in the team, and how did you respond?
Well, failure is such a strong word, but yes, in terms of the experiment, we had several failures based on the goals that we had set for the event. And actually, when they made their presentation to the management team, I knew a little bit more about the process than some of the other people in the room. And one of my first questions was like, hey, we didn't talk at all about the stuff that didn't work, because that's just as important. Yeah. But we tried a few. One, we were, based on the personas that we had developed, we were really trying to find insider events, kind of the first look at this brand new thing. And what we found, which isn't, crazy groundbreaking, is that when you're working with partners who are developing something new, sometimes it doesn't launch when they say it's going to, or, we still have this patio event that we're planning whenever the patio decides to open, which was supposed to be in June. So hopefully next June we'll be able to do it. So you just have to build in the schedule maybe backup plans for things like that. Yeah. And then we also tried some new technology that we had been kind of wanting to try for a while. We did some geofencing at some of our big station events, and we went, I keep looking back to like the very first thing you were talking about, we went from like, hey, you're at this event, you like this stuff, donate to Do 502, which skipped over many different steps in the process. So I think it might work better for something like sign up for Do 502 so you don't miss any other events that are happening like this. But we learned a few things along the way, so happy to talk about them.
Okay, I'm going to take some of the Slido questions. Some of them, they range from general to specific. So a very specific one about DCist is about you are American University holds your license. And
no.
I'm going to, does a university licensee situation complicate your ability to innovate?
In every imaginable way, yes.
Maybe you could describe some of the ways you have gotten past those blockers.
Let's focus on that, yes. Yes, it does.
Accepting payment.
Accepting payments. The reason we couldn't use the membership management tool that we wanted to use is because American University doesn't permit that particular payment processor. it applies to contracts, it applies to hiring, virtually everything. I guess what I would say is sort of how we have navigated that successfully. It's honestly impossible for me to think about that question just for DCist and not just for all of WAMU. And I would say I was worried when I came to work at a station that was owned by a university that the bureaucracy would squelch all of the things I was excited about doing and making happen. We are playing the long game with American University. We focus on relationships, and we find ways to sort of demonstrate our success in small ways, and we've earned greater leeway along the way. So I certainly, it's a very specific question, and I'd be happy to talk more about sort of how we navigate that bureaucracy. I think we've had some pretty amazing wins with it, actually.
It's speaking for my own. I've had similar
How did you
experience here at
enjoy
WBUR
navigating?
because we're part of Boston University, and the experiment mindset does not align with the long-term objectives of the university, right? So I think having a really good relationship with our lawyer who works at Boston University and works with our station, that has been amazing. And just to have somebody who understands the mission, right, that you can work with across. We refer to it as across the street because most of Boston University is across the street. But yeah. Okay, so a next question. It takes months, if not years, to convert a listener to a donor. I think the rule of thumb is it takes 7 years to convert a public radio listener, on-air listener. So how do you feel fast with that kind of time frame? Do you want to take this out with 2502?
Yeah, I mean, it just takes teasing out little proof points that show that, if you do a quick, small experiment, like adding a member perk to an email that's never seen them before, and half the people are like, why am I not getting what's in this section? And the other people are, and when you see people click on it or they don't, then you find out right away whether that's something that may have legs. So again, I think, obviously the journey from just consumer to donor is a long one, but there are little ways that you can test the propensity for people to get more engaged, and that is a proof point as to whether or not they'll become a donor.
Okay, so next question. Has your BizLab participation shown up in other projects and conversations? And so basically the question is, has it had an impact on your culture? Ellen, I see you nodding, so would you like to take that one?
Yes, and I've told this story a couple different times. We also had a team working with PRX on the Project Catapult, and they were also doing design thinking. So it's crazy because I was kind of on the outskirts of both of those projects, but I knew enough to be dangerous, and I'd be in a meeting and I would start to hear common language that we hadn't really used before that was kind of developing from the project. So I'd say that was fairly obvious, and then we've used a lot of the research tools, especially from the Intercept interviews that we've done. We have year one of our strategic plan is to spend a lot of time on audience research, and we're pairing kind of the scientific work. We're working with a company who does that with something that's more anecdotal that we're doing through Intercept interviews. So we've got all the Post-its and doing all that stuff.
Good, yeah. More Post-its, the better.
Yes.
Actually, I don't believe that, but I just feel like it. Andi, your team, I'm thinking specifically of Rachel and Maddie, are pretty agile thinkers and are willing to flex. Are they sort of using those kinds of approaches with other projects?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think, frankly, just our acquiring DCist began to infuse the organization with a sense of speed and nimbleness and agility that we hadn't previously had. And I would say it's added a couple other things, and specifically the participation in BizLab. And then also we participated in the Poynter Institute's Table Stakes program around the same time.
Wonderful things about, yeah.
And I would say where those two, sort of where that Venn diagram overlaps is around sort of time-limited intentional experimentation and metrics. And that has become much more a part of just sort of the verbiage we use around the building than previously.
That's fantastic.
Almost to a terrifying degree, because more specifically, our general manager is really excited about metrics this year. And so we're tracking about, 50 to 75 of them across the whole organization for this performance year. And I know the pendulum is going to swing back. Like, these are the 5 things that matter. But this is the year of all the metrics. So So thanks for that, Joan.
Yeah, it's awesome. Thank you, Ted Fuller, who's done a lot of our analysis for all the teams. I love the next question. Have you had issues with your board pushing back or meddling? I don't know if there are any board members in the room.
No, boy, we don't. I mean, we don't have a board. We're owned by American University, and their board. I mean, their board just figured out after the fact what it meant that we had acquired DC East, and then they got pretty interested. Once they saw the press about it, like, wait a minute, what is this? What does this mean for us? But no, we haven't had issues with meddling.
Ellen, has the board?
No, I mean, so part of our strategic plan was to do more research and experimentation. So once they signed off on that, then they were on board with the project. So,
I mean, something we've emphasized from the beginning, and Sarah mentioned it in the morning, is we didn't want a project that was going to be working against existing goals of the station. Mm-hmm. So that's one way I think you've been protected from that kind of resistance. But the other component that I've heard, well, from certainly WBUR's board, and I think other stations experience this, the board oftentimes wants the station to push further and faster. Mm-hmm. And so I almost think these kinds of projects can show that the station is trying and moving forward. So I also have not experienced any issues with board members. It's more sort of the other issues. Okay, so the next question. BizLab participation seems to connect you with kindred spirits outside the lab. Where do you find fellow travelers pursuing entrepreneurship in public media? Yeah, that's a great question. And if you're not aware, we've been hosting monthly webinars on topics that BizLab has found interesting. We've sort of projected them out, and through that have built a little bit of a newsletter around it and a mailing list. But I've also met people outside of public radio specifically, and I know we have a bunch of people in the room who are outside of public radio, which is fantastic. Where have you guys found community that's not public radio, but in this spirit of testing and trying new things and revenue and content?
Boy, I actually think, at least in my case, that's a better question for Rachel and Maddie, who I think have really needed sort of those allies in the field to figure things out. I would say our participation in the Table Stakes project did put us in touch with several other stations. I mean, we have these kindred stations that also have IST news outlets, right. Which has created sort of a network of its own that we turn to. But yeah, it hasn't been as much of an issue for me.
I think also Kelly and Lisa could answer that more. They were much more involved. It was like, for me, not to be involved was really hard. But I think having in some of the interviewing processes, bringing a different idea to the clients than relationships they have, or new clients that knew we were there but didn't know this was an opportunity. I think that was very beneficial and eye-opening for them.
I will just offer for this person who I sense has that entrepreneurial spirit that is maybe being a little restricted in some way. In a previous role, I created a group called Trailblazers Anonymous and just invited sort of anyone who wanted to talk about innovative projects inside or outside of public media to get together once a month and read or watch or listen to something and then talk about how we might apply those lessons. And for me at the time, feeling isolated in a bureaucratic organization, it gave me a sense of community within my organization and actually got enough traction that eventually suddenly the CEO and chief content officer started attending to see what was going on, and then became something where we would do a call once a month with other public media stations. So I think you can sort of start your own network in a way if that's what you're seeking.
That's really cool. Yeah, and there's an NPR and Friends Slack workspace, and I know there are different channels in that workspace that are for innovation and testing new things. That's another place that NPR stations I know have created community. I wanted to step aside from the questions for a second and ask you guys about what is the hardest part of sort of trying. You're keeping an eye on the big number, as you described, Paul. You have your eye on the big strategic goals. And what is the hardest part of letting a team go off and do something that is small? Because this is a small test. And so talk more sort of about maybe if you've had any struggles or resistance or just hesitations late at night where you're like, what if I just let them go off and do? Sorry, it's a pop question.
I don't think we really came across that much because I think we're always experimenting at LPM, which I'm sure everybody is, and it's usually in a small scale where maybe not everybody knows it's happening. But we're always willing to kind of jump in at the end and be like, hey, this is what we did, and here's what we learned from it. And sometimes that works better than maybe talking about a 12-month plan and step one is this, and everybody's underwhelmed by step one. So I don't know if that's the right answer or not, but that's kind of how we do it.
From meeting lots of stations, I don't think that is as common as you think it is. I think that is pretty unique, and I think that's really important. That's fantastic. Let's see. So, this is okay. Mini CEO, mini business. This is getting back to the firewall issues. Is it possible to train content people in business so that they can be the CEOs of their own internal business arm?
In my opinion, yes, absolutely. But I tend to think that if someone has the will to do something and the vision, like the training is the easiest part. I find it much harder to find people who have the will. So I think if you want to know the business side, if you have the drive and are seeking out opportunities, yes, absolutely. But if you're a content person and you kind of just don't want to have to think about it, no, I can't train you to do it.
Oh, funny. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your honesty on all that, because I think I think of the other side. Can you teach a revenue person, like many of us are in the room? Can you teach them to be content people and journalists?
I think so. I went to journalism school, and there wasn't really anything there that I didn't already know. I mean, it was a great experience and wonderful networking, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. But I went because I thought that they were going to unveil some secret to me that I couldn't have achieved on my own as like a freelance journalist, which I had been previously, and there was no one secret. So I'm convinced that really anyone can do it.
That's awesome. Okay.
I do want to say something.
Top secrets revealed.
Yeah, good thing nobody's recording this. I do want to say something to the last thing that you brought up that I think is important, which is the smallness versus the bigness, right?
Yeah, right.
We're this big organization, and we've acquired something really meaningful, but that is much smaller. And we struggle sometimes with, for instance, marshaling the marketing resources to put against DCIS that it deserves and that we have the vision for, but how do you do that when the broader organization needs those things too? And how do you split it up? Do you do it proportionally based on audience? But I think one way that we have to think about it is it's not just about the size and scale of the audience. Scale doesn't always exist in proportion to depth of engagement and loyalty. And DCIS will never achieve the audience size that we currently have in weekly CUME on WAMU, but it already has a greater depth of fan engagement, and I think that has a much faster path down the funnel than just somebody who's a casual listener to WAMU. So I think that's one way that we have to justify experimenting in the space of loyalty and engagement.
Have you had any trouble making that argument internally? For example, the marketing department. I know many marketing departments are strapped. They don't want to launch a new brand. That's a whole lot of work.
Yes, definitely. Directing resources and just sort of support and attention towards DCIST has been an ongoing struggle, and it's one that I think Rachel and Maddie feel much more viscerally than I do. I think it has helped that DCIST has proved itself on so many levels. And we're getting to a point now where we're looking at the bigger picture of our news and content operation and thinking about how we might redirect more of existing resources towards DCIST because it's a thing that's working. It's a model that's working. And I think we're still in a common place in public media land where we're doing lots of things. Some are working better than others. Some we feel like we have to do. We have to have a robust experience on WAMU.org because people go there and don't they expect all the things to be there. And I think we're in a competitive landscape. There isn't as much time as we think, and we actually have to place some bets. And we have something that's working, and I feel a great sense of urgency to put some wind behind that quickly while it's still working.
That makes so much sense to me. So I'm convinced.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Okay, next question is, how did participating in this work better position you going forward? Beyond the project, what culture changes has this created, and how do you ensure that they stick? Paul, could you start off taking this one and maybe mention some of I'll let you take it.
Oh, I want to know what you want me to say.
Some of we've sort of put in some technology practices at your station, like with the team, which I think jumped them forward on some of the projects, some aspects of the project.
Well, absolutely. Investing in progress, because we typically say we don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the resources to do it, so let's keep doing it the way we used to, which typically isn't very successful. So giving us that authority and the opportunity to make that investment, I think is already paying forward. Reading the question, I think also directly connecting, there's a question about the firewall as well, and we had nothing to do with content. We didn't talk to any news directors, we didn't talk to any stations about the news content they were receiving in exchange for the revenue opportunities that we created, so that we didn't talk to them at all.
So is that a good thing, or because it maintains the firewall, or is that bad because you don't have their alignment?
I think it's a good thing. You know, I think, was it your term of poking the bear?
Oh yeah, we've been talking about don't poke the bear all.
But I think for Lisa and Kelly, it gave them the freedom to focus on the revenue opportunities in this, this 15 seconds of impact, which is really, really cool. That gave them the freedom to do that. And I think that the entire organization should look at them a little bit differently and the sacrifices that they've made. This was a big thing for them. They have a choice of making a cold call or servicing a client or working on this project. And so I think the organization ought to recognize, what they've done to continue revenue, because it's something is really important that many stations in California don't have a journalist, don't have any access to state of California government reporting.
Right.
So.
Well, I'd just like to add to that I know everybody's always working on breaking down silos, but this project kind of forced us with the new product that we had acquired, we had gotten enough sponsorship dollars to pay off the investment, but then it was there, and most of the organization wasn't super aware of what was happening with it or how it fit into the larger culture and organizational goals. So through this project, we actually this project did not have a member of the Do 502 team on it.
Yes.
Which was both a challenge and an opportunity. I think they appreciated that people from our revenue team were stepping up and saying, hey, we need to show what we can do with this new thing that we have.
And you have 2 Do 502 employees?
Yes, there are a few people that's been kind of part of their time working on the project, but and now even Tracy mentioned we had one of our team members leave, and she was worried about, okay, now what happens? This was like the events person, so she's like, okay, what's going to happen with these 12 months of events that we have planned? But the Do 502 team has really embraced that, and they understand that it's important, and it's a way to kind of integrate them into the larger organization. So it's been really good in that way, and I think those cultural changes will last.
Back to the mini CEO model, are the Do 502 team, are they like their own little business where they're concerned about all aspects of success of Do 502, or are they more of a traditional content team?
I think now more so than before, they're more like a traditional business. I think, often the content team is just worried about, okay, my job is to put out this awesome newsletter about X, and we're always preaching, it's just as important to fund the mission as the mission is, because you can't do the mission without the funding. So this was a good way to kind of also wake them up to that concept. So, we can't keep doing this thing that requires resources if we can't show some revenue attached to it. So,
I mentioned in the early morning about the concept of product, and I always think of a product as, in the content space, I think of a product as a 3-legged stool where you have content, engagement, and revenue. And if you don't have all of those things balanced, they need to be balanced with a leader that understands all 3. And oftentimes that falls to the CEO or the general manager at the very highest level. But it's interesting when it can come a little bit lower, where you can have the head of the product itself be able to balance all 3 of those priorities. Okay, how do we address the perception from our audience about piercing the firewall? Should we be 100% transparent? So I'm going to try to rephrase the question, hopefully correctly. If we are working together on projects, and if somebody who is, say, heading up content is also concerned about the revenue, how is that going to be perceived by the audience? And is that, should we be totally honest about it, or should we not address it and it's okay? What do you think?
I just have a quick thought on that. We've been talking a lot about the difference between a business and a nonprofit, and I think that there are different expectations from people. They would never expect the CEO of a for-profit company to just deliver something that they weren't sure would end up in revenue, would result in revenue. So I think some ways the expectations might be a little bit unfair, but in other ways we might kind of overblow how closely they're paying attention to that in some ways.
How closely the audience?
The audience, yes. Mm-hmm. In my opinion.
What was the rest of you?
I guess, I would say at the very least, I don't think our audience is thinking about a thing called the firewall. I think they're thinking, can I trust it? Do I trust it? Mm-hmm. And the it is, do I trust the editorial decision-making process that resulted in this coverage that I'm experiencing? And I think there are a lot of different ways to establish trust in public media, just as in life, which is explain how you got there, show how you got there. I think it absolutely has to be the case that you're not making decisions based on, whether they're going to preserve this relationship with the sponsor versus this one. Like, there has to be space to make those decisions discrete from the revenue pressure. But I think in terms of incorporating revenue strategies and thinking about how to market and distribute your content, first of all, our competitors are doing this and running circles around us in many ways, so we really don't have a choice. But I absolutely think it's possible, and it is in our best business interest to continue to prioritize the trust that we have with our audience. Mm-hmm. And I think they will give us a lot of room to demonstrate and field test that trust.
Oh, that makes sense. Paul, do you have comments?
Well, I think from the revenue side is kind of that mean, dark place where we're selling anything we can. We do have the opportunity to meet with the newsroom and the journalists and the storytellers. And I believe that the better they understand how we do what we do, as well as see that we respect the importance of what they do, goes a long way. And it gives them trust to know that we're not going to kind of screw up what they're doing. And but it is very collaborative. And the more I explain to them how we raise money for that podcast or how we raise money for this network, it validates what they do as well. And I think that's really important.
That's a really wonderful point.
I would say too, I think, we like to think that there's this, that, we talk about it as a wall or a line. Like, we'd like to think it's straight and impenetrable, but at least in my experience, I'm sort of in a constant conversation with our head of sponsorship around packages that the sponsorship team has devised around different content products. And they're constantly, it's like 1/3 of the things they present, it's like, oh, great, yes, we should absolutely do that. Then there's 1/3 where it's like, no, we're totally not doing that. That would compromise the sense of trust and the perception of the audience. And then there's this stuff in the middle where it's like, could we put a sponsor tag at the end of a promotional message that we're already doing for an upcoming program? You know what, let's try that and see what the audience response is. Let's test this a little bit and get a feel for it. And I think that's a rich and important place right there, is the place where you actually try that stuff and see how it feels and see the reaction.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I love that that's about testing and learning. So that's a great way to end this.
You win.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, thank you, all three of you. Let's give the panelists a